You've been in that meeting, the one where someone who clearly doesn't understand the problem is loudly explaining the solution, and everyone around the table is nodding. And you who actually studied this, who actually thought it through, who can see 3 steps ahead exactly where this is going to fall apart, you sit there, quiet, watching. Or maybe it was your workplace, your neighborhood committee, your government, your family gathering. Somewhere, at some point, you looked around and asked yourself a question you were probably too polite to say out loud. How did these people end up in charge of anything? Here's the uncomfortable truth that Schopenhauer saw coming nearly 200 years ago, before psychology gave it a name, before the internet made it impossible to ignore, before you had a word for that specific exhaustion you feel when the loudest voice in the room is also the emptiest one. The world is not run by the most capable. It never was, and it never will be. And today, in this video, we're going to look directly at why. Not to make you bitter, not to give you permission to feel superior, but to hand you something far more valuable: clarity. Because once you understand the mechanism, the actual philosophical architecture underneath this madness, you stop wasting your energy fighting it. You stop being surprised, and you start moving through the world with your eyes fully open. Schopenhauer didn't just complain about this, he explained it, and what he found is darker, more precise, and ultimately more liberating than anything the self-help industry will ever tell you. Let's begin. Let's start with something you've already experienced, but may not have fully named. Think about the last time you had to make a genuinely difficult decision. One that required weighing competing variables, tolerating uncertainty, holding multiple possibilities in your mind at once. You probably felt cautious, maybe even anxious. You second-guessed yourself. You looked for more information. You were aware, viscerally aware of everything you didn't know. Now think about someone you've watched make the same kind of decision, confidently, loudly, without hesitation, and get it spectacularly wrong. They weren't lying. They weren't performing. They genuinely felt certain, because they lacked the very understanding that would have shown them why they shouldn't be. This is what modern psychology eventually labeled the Dunning-Kruger effect, the cognitive pattern where incompetence prevents accurate self-assessment. The less you understand a domain, the less equipped you are to recognize your own ignorance within it. You don't know what you don't know, so you feel fine. But here's what most people miss. Schopenhauer described this dynamic long before Dunning and Kruger were born. He wrote, "Every man takes the limits of his own field of vision for the limits of the world." Read that again. Every man, not just the fool, not just the ambitious mediocrity, every man is vulnerable to mistaking the boundary of his understanding for the boundary of reality itself. The difference between the wise person and the unwise one is simply that the wise person knows this about themselves, and that self-knowledge breeds caution, breeds hesitation, breeds exactly the kind of measured, careful, quiet confidence that is almost universally disadvantaged in public life. Because public life doesn't reward accuracy, it rewards certainty. When you walk into a room projecting hesitation, even intelligent, warranted hesitation, you read as weak. When someone else walks in projecting unearned conviction, they read as strong. The crowd follows the signal, not the substance. And this is not a modern failure. This is not a product of social media or the collapse of expertise culture or whatever this week's civilizational diagnosis happens to be. Schopenhauer understood this as structural, baked into the nature of human cognition and social dynamics at the most fundamental level. He also wrote, "The world is my idea. meaning that each person constructs reality through the lens of their own perception, their own will. And if that lens is narrow, if the apparatus doing the constructing is crude and unexamined, then they live in a smaller world, and they live in it completely, without doubt, without awareness of its smallness. That is not stupidity in the cruel sense. That is the human condition operating at its default setting. But here's what makes it politically explosive, socially dangerous, and maddening for people like you. That smallness, that unexamined certainty is enormously effective at accumulating power. Why? Because power, in almost every social context, is not allocated by accuracy. It is allocated by social consensus, and social consensus follows confidence, volume, and simplicity, always. The person who says, "I'm not entirely sure, but here are 3 competing frameworks we might consider," is almost never the person who ends up in charge. The person who says, "Here's what we're doing," regardless of whether they're right, usually is. Here's where it gets deeper and darker. Schopenhauer's central philosophical insight, the engine that drives everything else in his thinking, is what he called the will. Not willpower in the motivational poster sense, something far more primal and far less flattering. The will, for Schopenhauer, is the blind, striving, purposeless force that underlies all existence. It is not rational. It is not benevolent. It does not care about truth or justice or merit. It simply wants. It presses forward. It seeks dominance, reproduction, survival, not because these things lead anywhere meaningful, but because that is simply what it does. And here is the brutal implication. The people most fully in the grip of the will, the ones most driven, most hungry, most relentlessly oriented toward status and acquisition, are often the least burdened by the kind of reflective intelligence that would slow them down. Think about what reflective intelligence actually does to ambition. It introduces doubt. It asks, "But should I?" It calculates second-order consequences. It feels the weight of other people's experience. It pauses. Raw will does not pause. Schopenhauer wrote, "Talent hits a target no one else can see." But genius, in his framework, is precisely what the will suppresses, because seeing the target no one else can see requires stepping back from the immediate drive, requires quieting the will enough to observe it. And that quieting, that philosophical distance, is almost never what gets you elected, promoted, or placed at the head of the table. What gets you there is relentless forward motion, appetite, projection, the confidence to act before you've finished thinking or before thinking has really begun at all. Modern neuroscience has now caught up to this. We know that decision-making in high-status individuals is disproportionately driven by subcortical reward-seeking circuits, the same circuitry associated with risk-taking, dominance behavior, and social aggression. The prefrontal cortex, the seat of careful, reflective, long-term reasoning, is actually inhibited in certain states of high arousal and social competition. In other words, the more intensely someone wants power, the less of their brain is dedicated to the kind of thinking that would tell them whether they deserve it. This is not an accident. This is the will expressing itself most purely. And here is the part that will frustrate you most, that frustrated Schopenhauer most. It works. It works socially. It works politically. It works in organizations and families and friend groups and online platforms. Raw, unreflective drive is extraordinarily effective at acquiring and holding influence. You are not watching a bug in the system. You are watching the system working exactly as it was built, by nature, not by design, to work. The question is what you do with that knowledge, and we're going to get there.
But first, you need to understand one more layer of why this keeps reproducing itself, why each generation inherits the same configuration, why reform never quite takes hold.
Here's a truth that most people, including most intelligent people, refuse to fully accept. The majority of human beings, most of the time, do not want to be led toward what is true. They want to be led toward what is familiar, what confirms what they already feel, what gives a name and a face to what they already suspect. This is not cynicism. This is Schopenhauer's anthropology, and it has been confirmed so thoroughly by modern social psychology that it barely qualifies as controversial anymore. He wrote, "Almost all of our sorrows spring out of our relations with other people." And buried in that observation is something profound. Other people, for most individuals, are not primarily a source of truth or growth. They are a source of validation, of belonging, of the reassurance that one's own perception of reality is correct. What does this mean for power? It means the most effective leaders throughout history in every domain are rarely the ones who expand people's understanding. They are the ones who reflect people's existing beliefs back to them with enough force and confidence to feel like revelation. The demagogue doesn't introduce new ideas, he crystallizes existing resentments. The charismatic CEO doesn't invent new strategy. He tells the organization what it already wants to hear about itself. The popular intellectual doesn't challenge the crowd's assumptions. He validates them with impressive vocabulary. This is the mirror dynamic, and it is devastatingly effective because it satisfies the deepest social need most people have, not understanding, but recognition. Now contrast that with what genuine intelligence actually does in a social context. The person who truly sees clearly tends to notice things that are uncomfortable. They point out the contradiction in the plan. They ask the question nobody wanted asked. They slow things down when everyone else wants to accelerate. They represent friction. And friction, however useful it is for precision, is almost universally experienced as threat. Schopenhauer understood this from bitter personal experience. He scheduled his lectures at the University of Berlin at the same time as Hegel, certain that students would choose substance over spectacle. They did not. Hegel's hall was full. Schopenhauer's was empty. He eventually stopped trying. That story is not just biographical detail. It is a case study in exactly the dynamic we're describing. Hegel, whether or not you accept Schopenhauer's assessment of his philosophy, gave people grandeur. He gave them a sense that history was moving towards something, that their world was rational and purposeful and spiraling upward toward the absolute. It felt magnificent. Schopenhauer gave people the truth as he saw it, that the will is blind, that suffering is structural, that most human striving leads to nowhere. Which lecture hall would you fill? The crowd always chooses the mirror over the window, and the people who hold up the most flattering mirrors accumulate the most power. This is not new. This is not fixable. This is the architecture.
Let's be precise about something, because vague frustration is useless. The problem is not simply that individuals make bad choices about who to follow. The problem is that the systems we have built, institutions, organizations, democracies, corporations, academic hierarchies, structurally favor a specific profile of person. And that profile has almost no overlap with the profile of a deeply intelligent, honest, reflective human being. Think about what modern institutions actually reward at each stage of advancement. At entry level, compliance, willingness to perform tasks without excessive questioning, social adaptability, the ability to seem enthusiastic about things that don't warrant enthusiasm. At middle levels, political skill, the capacity to manage upward, to make superiors feel intelligent and validated, while managing downward to appear competent and decisive. Truth-telling is optional, often counterproductive. At senior levels, confidence performance, the ability to project certainty to large groups, charisma, the particular kind of vision that is simple enough to be understood quickly and ambitious enough to generate excitement. At no stage in this progression is accuracy the primary selection criterion. At no stage is the willingness to say something unwelcome but true systematically rewarded. It is frequently punished. Schopenhauer wrote, "Every truth passes through 3 stages. First, it is ridiculed. Second, it is violently opposed. Third, it is accepted as self-evident." Notice what happens to the person who carries the truth in the first and second stages. They are ridiculed, they are opposed, they are frequently removed from influence precisely because of their accuracy. And by the time the third stage arrives, by the time their insight is accepted as self-evident, someone else is usually standing at the podium receiving the credit. This is not paranoia. This is the documented pattern of almost every significant intellectual and scientific advance in human history. The mechanism is elegant in its cruelty. The traits that make someone effective at navigating institutional hierarchies, confidence, social fluency, political calculation, simplicity of message, are in systematic tension with the traits that make someone genuinely valuable to the project of understanding or improving anything. And because institutions self-perpetuate, because the people who rise select for people similar to themselves, each generation inherits a slightly more optimized version of the same configuration. The machine doesn't select for intelligence, it selects for fitness to the machine. And the machine was built by the will, by blind, striving, socially competitive human nature, not by reason. This is the mediocrity machine. It is not evil. It is not conspiratorial. It is just the inevitable output of systems designed by and for the average of human nature, which means it will, on average, elevate people of average depth, average courage, and average honesty to positions of maximal influence. You have been living inside this machine your entire life. The frustration you feel? That's the friction between your perceptions and the machine's preferences. Now, what do you actually do?
Here's the mistake that costs the most capable people the most time. They try to fix it. They believe, because they are problem solvers, because they are oriented toward truth and improvement, that if they can just explain clearly enough, argue persuasively enough, demonstrate visibly enough, the system will correct itself. That the mediocrity will recognize itself as mediocrity and step aside. It won't. And Schopenhauer would tell you exactly why. You cannot appeal to reason in a domain governed by will. The person who holds power because of confidence and social performance does not experience that power as illegitimate. They experience it as deserved. Their very lack of reflective depth means they do not have access to the self-assessment that would show them otherwise. You are not dealing with someone who secretly knows they're inadequate and is hoping you won't notice. You are dealing with someone who genuinely, completely, does not see what you see. He wrote, "With people of limited ability, modesty is merely honesty. With those of great ability, it is hypocrisy."
So when you try to reason the unreasonable into self-awareness, you are not just wasting energy, you are actively misreading the situation. You are assuming a shared epistemic framework that does not exist. Worse, the attempt often backfires. When you visibly challenge someone whose power rests on performed confidence, you threaten the very mechanism that sustains them. Their response is rarely reconsideration. It is almost always social aggression, undermining you, dismissing you, isolating you from the group. Not because they are malicious, but because that's what the will does when threatened. It defends. And you, thoughtful, fair-minded, reluctant to play dirty, are almost always outgunned in that kind of fight. So what's the alternative? Not surrender, not cynicism. Schopenhauer himself didn't retreat into paralysis. He retreated into philosophy, into the systematic, clear-eyed understanding of reality as it actually is, rather than as he wished it were. The practical translation of this is something like strategic restraint. You stop investing energy in converting people who cannot be converted. You stop explaining yourself to rooms that are not listening. You stop measuring your worth against a system that was not built to recognize it. You begin, instead, to select ruthlessly for environments, teams, relationships, institutions that have somehow managed to reward substance over performance. They exist, they are rare, but they are findable by those with the patience and perceptiveness to look. And you begin to separate your internal sense of competence from its external validation. Because if you are genuinely capable and genuinely intelligent, you already know it, without needing the mediocrity machine to confirm it. The need for that confirmation is itself a form of entrapment. Stop arguing with the machine. Start using it consciously and building around it whenever possible.
Let's be direct about what this philosophy actually demands of you, because this is the chapter where most philosophical videos get soft, where they pivot to something vague about inner peace and leave you with a beautiful metaphor but no actual direction. Schopenhauer doesn't offer easy comfort, but he does offer something better, a framework that actually matches reality. The first move is acceptance. Not passive acceptance, not the kind of acceptance that slides into resignation and becomes an excuse for inaction. The acceptance that precedes effective action. The recognition that the will governs most of the social world, that systems select for fitness to systems, that the majority will follow confidence over substance, and that none of this is going to be changed by your frustration about it. He wrote, "Compassion is the basis of morality," and buried in this, underappreciated, is the instruction not to despise the people who frustrate you. Understand them. They are not villains. They are the will expressing itself, just as you are, just as everyone is, at varying levels of reflective awareness. The difference is that you can see the mechanism. That is your advantage, not your burden, if you use it correctly. Here is what using it correctly looks like. First, stop performing for the wrong audience. Your intelligence, your depth, your careful analysis, these are assets, but they are not universally valued. Direct them at people and contexts that can actually receive them. A brilliant argument delivered to the wrong room is not a wasted argument, it's a misdirected one. Learn to read rooms. Second, cultivate radical selectivity. Schopenhauer himself retreated into his study, his books, his music, his poodle. He is often mocked for this, but consider what he produced in that solitude, a complete philosophical system of extraordinary coherence and influence that outlasted every rival who mocked him. Selectivity is not isolation, it is conservation of signal. Third, let go of the scoreboard.
The metrics that the mediocrity machine uses, titles, public recognition, institutional status, are genuinely poor proxies for the things that matter: clarity of thought, depth of understanding, quality of work, integrity of character. If you keep measuring yourself against those metrics, you will spend your life angry at a scoreboard that was never tracking the right game. Fourth, find your equivalent of philosophy. Schopenhauer turned his clear-sightedness into a body of work. You may not be a philosopher, but the practice of converting honest perception into something productive, writing, building, creating, teaching, solving real problems, is the same move, scaled to your domain. The point is not to transcend the world. Schopenhauer didn't believe in transcendence. The point is to see the world clearly enough that it stops having the power to make you delusional about it, either in the direction of naive hope or in the direction of bitter contempt. Both are forms of the will controlling you. Clarity is the exit.
Here is the thing that ties all of it together. The reason idiots, and I use that word with full philosophical weight and zero personal cruelty, control everything around you, is not because the world is broken. It is because the world is working exactly as human nature built it to work. The will is not rational. The will does not select for wisdom. The will selects for force, for appetitive, striving, relentless, unreflective force. And the systems that humans have built to organize themselves, every hierarchy, every institution, every social structure, are downstream of that will. They reflect it. This means the game most people are playing, the game of seeking validation, recognition, and power within those systems, is a game rigged by the will for the will. And the people who win it most completely are almost by definition the people most fully given over to the will, least reflective, most certain, most relentlessly driven. Schopenhauer's insight, the one that changes everything if you let it land, is that the intelligent person's task is not to win that game, it is to see through it. Not to withdraw from life, not to pretend the stakes don't exist, but to understand the game clearly enough that it no longer defines your sense of yourself or your sense of what's possible. Accept it. The world is not meritocratic. Accept it. Confidence outperforms competence in almost every public arena. Accept it. The systems around you will continue to elevate the unreflective and sideline the careful. Accept it, not because it's fine, but because clear-eyed acceptance is the only stable platform from which anything genuinely useful can be built. You cannot save everyone. You cannot fix every institution. You cannot make the herd value what it is not built to value. But you can think clearly. You can work with precision. You can choose your contexts deliberately. You can build things of genuine value in the spaces the mediocrity machine ignores. And those spaces are larger than you think. Schopenhauer wrote, "The more unintelligent a man is, the less mysterious existence seems to him." The fact that existence still seems mysterious to you, that this all still bothers you, is not a weakness. It is the signal.
If this video cracked something open for you, if it gave shape to a frustration you've been carrying for years but couldn't quite articulate, the philosophical clarity Schopenhauer points toward is not just an intellectual exercise. It requires a mind that can actually be still, that can observe the will without being consumed by it. And one more thing. If this video made sense to you, not just intellectually, but somewhere deeper, write in the comments, "It made sense to me." That's it. 3 words. It tells me you're here, that you're one of the people who can actually see clearly. and it tells the algorithm to show this to more of them. If you haven't subscribed, now's the time. We don't make content for everyone. We make it for the ones who can handle the truth of it. I'll see you in the next one.